Oh, it's great to be here. Let me know if you guys can hear me all right. Not sure if it's on. Is it on? Okay. Everybody hear me back there? So, I saw that slide up there about nurses being compassionate and blah, blah, blah. Well, my ex-wife is a nurse. And I swear to God, I'm never marrying another one. And then, of course, I'm married now to a nurse. I don't know that, yeah, they are pretty compassionate, but unless you're bleeding or your bones are broken, you never complain about anything. You don't say anything, right? And so I was getting dressed, and I said, hey, I'm going to speak up at Wilmington. She said, oh, Civil War talk? I said, yeah. And I said, you want to come? She said, no. I said, okay. And I got dressed and didn't have this shirt on. I had a different shirt on. And she says to me, I said, how do I look? And she said, yeah. She goes, that looks nice. You might want to put a black shirt on because it's more slimming. Okay, so I did. Well, it's a great honor to be here. I know some of you and haven't met all of you, and I'm looking forward to meeting as many of you as possible. So tonight we're going to talk about something that's near and dear to my heart. I hope we have a lot of moms around because I'm going to explode heads tonight. This is 30 years of research. I'm going to give you about 2% of what I've found. It's going to change the way, and I like a persuasionist, like a hypnotist, I'm going to tell you something up front to put it in your head. But it's real. It's going to change the way, this is my goal, of you looking at the entire first year strategy of the war because you've never been told anything about what really was going on, especially on the Confederate side. And a lot of this research is new. A lot of the research I found, it's primary material. I've been digging for a long time. And so what I've discovered, I think, really changes the way we're going to look at things. And I'm putting this all into a book. About 3/4 written. It's going to end up being 2 books, and I'll tell you why when I finish. But let's jump into a guy that you've never really heard of. And I can tell you right now, he's the most important person you've never heard of. George Washington Raines. This is how George Raines and President Davis, with a secret little handshake in a meeting inside a hotel room in Richmond, changed the course of the American Civil War. So let's talk a little bit about Raines. So Raines was born in North Carolina. He was raised in a family with tremendous education. So he spoke Latin when he was a little kid. He studied Shakespeare. I mean, he was a very bright guy. And what he was doing, and he didn't know it at the time, is he was starting to build what we call a talent stack. And you're going to see when we get to the point of the Civil War, he developed the talent stack and probably was one of the very few or only people that could have done what he did because of the talent stack that he created. So Raines goes on and he goes to West Point and he graduates in the famous class of 1842 with lots of other Civil War generals that you would have heard of. But before that time, Raines had a very interesting experience in that he was applying to West Point. He got turned down because of some bureaucratic mistakes. He had an older brother, Gabriel Raines. You might have heard of him because he did the bombs and torpedoes and that sort of thing. He's the more famous of the brothers, but he doesn't deserve to be the more famous of the brothers, as you'll see tonight. So George is 16 years old, and he takes a trip. The family moves from North Carolina to Alabama. He goes to the name Jefferson Davis. Davis always remembered meeting this young kid because he was so smart and just as sharp as can be. He's out there, he goes on tours and some Indian expeditions, and he's out there for a long time. He makes his way back, all alone again, partway by canoe, which is sort of amazing when you think about it. Eventually, he gets into West Point. He graduates 3rd in his class from West Point, and now he's an engineer. You graduate toward the top of your class, you get to go into the engineers. He hated engineering. He learned it, worked on Fort Warren and all that, but he found it very boring. He didn't like that kind of work, and he decided, I'm going to take a voluntary demotion into the artillery. Somehow, I'm not quite sure exactly when, he met Winfield Scott, General Winfield Scott, head of the Army. And Scott loved him. And Scott's like, are you sure you want to take this demotion into the 4th Artillery? Yeah, I do. He goes into the artillery, gets stationed at Fort Monroe, and he's doing his thing there. Then he goes back up to West Point, and he gets a teaching position. So he's teaching at West Point. He's got a lot of this various experience of engineering now, and he's got this degree, and he's got a college education and traveling, so he's building up his talent stack. Well, the Mexican War comes. All of Raines' friends and graduates are going where? They're going to Mexico. They're going to fight. He's like, I'm not going to stay up here and teach a college class when everybody's going down to Mexico. My God, I'm a soldier. So he finagles another transfer. He gets to the front and he goes down to southern Texas to Port Isabel. What does he do in Port Isabel? He relays out the fortifications of the fort, and then he manages the logistics depot. It's a gigantic depot for quartermaster stores for the troops that are in Mexico. Okay? So now Raines has massive logistical ability at the front in an active campaign. He takes a boat, he travels to Veracruz, and Veracruz, with the Navy's off Veracruz getting ready to invade Veracruz. He's on board with several famous commanders there, captains, and he's in the middle of these meetings, and he's just this young guy. And Winfield Scott wants him to take Mexican prisoners, go into Veracruz and spy for him. And so you're going to trade these prisoners, but what you're going to do is you're going to keep track of all the fortifications and do all that kind of stuff and write it all down. Raines has a Mexican War diary. It's fantastic. It ends mid-sentence. Everything I found of his that's fantastic in primary ends mid-sentence. It drives you crazy. But this ends mid-sentence, 95 pages. It's fantastic. He talks about going to Veracruz and landing, fighting, laying out the lines, helping take the siege to a successful conclusion. Then he gets attached to Gideon Pillow, Civil War infamy, not a particularly good commander of Confederates, and he's a staff officer. So now, from there all the way to all the battles in Mexico City, he's a combat staff officer. So now he understands staff work. He's been in combat, he sees a lot of combat. He ends up being wounded. He storms Chapultepec. He's involved in all of it. And so now he sees the inner workings of how combat works, how staff officers works, how command relationships in the field works. So now you're starting to see you've got these different abilities that are just stacking up. But when the war ends, he spends some more time in Mexico, does a few different kinds of things, goes back to West Point for a while, and he's back in the Army now, still in the Army now, and he goes to fight the Seminoles in Florida, and he's doing different things, but he's bored. He's bored with peacetime life. It's the 1850s. He's running a fort in New York, Fort Hamilton. And what does he do? He ends up the equivalent today of marrying into Bill Gates' family. Okay? I wasn't so lucky. I married for love. We don't know exactly how he met Francis Ramsdell, but the Ramsdell family, the dad, Homer, ran the shipping on the Hudson. They lived up in Newburgh, New York. He owned part of the Erie Railroad. He had factories. Literally, he was one of the richest families in American history at that time, Homer Ramsdell. Raines was, at the time, I think 34-ish when he met the daughter, who was like 14. And the only letter that exists between the two, the only one, is her letter back to him, 1853-ish, and it talks about his letter to her. And they talk about it, loving, they're all, my family sends their love. So they know each other somehow. I think he gave the family a tour of Fort Hamilton. And he ends up getting permission to write to this young girl who's, has this family that's mega wealthy. How could that be? And somehow this rogue commander got permission. I think when you see what happens, you'll understand why he got permission. The dad wanted something. My wife was explaining it to me. She says, think about it. She goes, women were property then. There's a certain trading element involved. There was something the dad wanted from Raines in exchange for being able to see his daughter. And I thought, oh my gosh, that's right, because he gets married in 1856. He's 38, the same age as her mother. And he resigns from the Army. He goes to Newburgh, New York, and he runs the Washington Iron Works, which is one of the biggest facilities owned by Homer, and he runs it like a dream. He grows it. He's got dozens and dozens and dozens of employees. They build locomotives and boilers and steam engines, and he's supplying things all around the country. He's hiring people, firing people. This place was massive, and Raines ran it. And so his dad somehow knew this guy is a genius, and he was a genius. And he was capable, and he was funny, and he was just a wonderful guy. They loved him.
It sounds like you did.
Oh, yeah. I paid her to say that. So they love this guy. He's up there. It's 1856 now. He's getting money. He's got a little girl that's born in 1859. Things are going really good. And then the war comes. Well, Ray stayed north until North Carolina. He's from Newburgh. Leaves the South. And when it leaves, he tells the family, I have to go south. The father, except for one time, never spoke to him again. It was one of those bitter splits you can possibly imagine. He goes south, he takes a ship, he goes south, comes down to Savannah, works his way up to Richmond, gets to Richmond July 8th, 1861. His wife's up north, his infant daughter's up north. He doesn't see them for a little more than a year. He's down there in the south, he goes into Richmond, and he has a meeting. And the meeting, the meeting is with President Davis. And it's immediate. He gets to town, they have a meeting. And he meets with him and Gorgas. Hosea Gorgas is the head of the Ordnance Department. The meeting's in the Spotswood Hotel, it's just the three of them. And the meeting is to build a national gunpowder factory for the South. Now, right now, some of you are going, don't snore. This changed the Civil War. It changes everything. Everything, and you've never heard it. When I tell you this, what happened, you're going to go, are you kidding me? Watch, I guarantee you. They have this meeting. It was Davis's idea in February of 61. We can't make gunpowder. The South had no gunpowder mills to speak of. Zero. A couple little small blasting mills, but zero. Military-grade gunpowder, historians do not understand this. I've tested historians. I'm a historian. Until I started studying this, I didn't even know it. People don't understand. Gunpowder isn't gunpowder, isn't gunpowder. Military-grade gunpowder is completely different than blasting powder or pistol powder or powder you need to blow a stump or a mine. Utterly different. The kind of powder you need for a cannon doesn't work for a Seacoast gun, doesn't work in a field artillery. The cannon, gunpowder in a field artillery piece doesn't work in a musket and doesn't work in a big Seacoast cannon. Pistol powder can't go in a cannon. They're all different. They're different sizes, they're glazed and finished a little differently. So you've got to be able to make all of this gunpowder, and you've got to be able to separate it into the right sizes. It's got to be of consistent quality and kind of a character. And then you've got to get it to the front, and you're going to burn so much of it that you can't fight unless you've got an endless supply of it, and the only mills are in the north. Okay? Davis knew it. He said, look, we can't depend on importation because the gunpowder comes in wet, it might not come in at all, we don't know how to do it. We got to distribute, we got to make a big central mill. He gives it to Raines. Raines demands carte blanche. If I'm going to run this, because he has problems with superiors, he doesn't like to take orders. He wants to do things his way because they're usually right. And he says, if I'm going to do this, I want carte blanche, I'm going to run this place the way I want to run it. Davis says yes. Do you know anything about Jefferson Davis? That's a huge concession because the whole Confederacy was depending on this mill. Raines gets on a train, leaves the 10th of July. That's how fast this is. Gets a commission, he's on a train. He goes to Nashville. In Nashville, he meets with, Alexander Johnson's not there yet, it's July. He meets with Governor Jam Harris. Very quickly, this is where we start talking about the strategy of the war and how everything changes. In Tennessee, there was a small mill called the Sycamore Mill. It was about 23 miles outside Nashville, so it's not defended by the Nashville perimeter. The Sycamore Mill made 50, 80, 100 pounds a day blasting powder. couldn't do much with it. Raines ends up, within the next few months, putting big equipment in there, and making it, and importing it, and designing that mill so it can actually produce military-grade gunpowder. That's the Sycamore mill. We'll come back to that. He works with Harris. They turn over all the contracts to him in Tennessee that are state contracts, and Raines is going to oversee all that while he's building a mill. But now he's got to figure out, where does he put the mill? He really had two locations he was going to plan to put it, Atlanta and Augusta. It's hard to place a mill that's big with the requirements that you need. Because what are the requirements? Well, it can't be freezing cold because you can't use candles to light it while you're making gunpowder, right, or heat it. It's got to be by railroads. It's got to have water power. It's got to be a place where there's a lot of people that can be workers. It's got to have trees nearby that you can use for charcoal. Charcoal is one of the ingredients. The other ingredients are niter, saltpeter and niter, and sulfur. We'll talk about those too. So now, Raines is looking around, and one of the biggest things is you can't put a mill where it can be destroyed. Because if you're going to produce all your gunpowder in one location, and that mill is destroyed with a cavalry raid, with the invasion of the Union Army, what happens to your military effort? It goes kaput. So you got to have all those elements together, and where can you put them? He looks at Atlanta. He says no, for reasons that we don't need to talk about. He goes over to Augusta, and he puts it in Augusta. Augusta's down here, the red arrow. So there's Augusta. Raines goes down here to Nashville. There's the Sycamore Powder Mill right outside Nashville. Confederate front eventually goes into Kentucky. We'll talk about that. Raines also, they set up a mill about 60 miles southeast of Nashville called the Manchester Mill, or the Coffee County Mill. And Raines is to get that up and running. These are small mills, 200, 300, 400 pounds a day, right? So not much. And that's what it looks like in 1861 in September, in July, August, September, when Raines goes out there. All of you have heard of Elbert Sidney Johnston. Elbert Sidney Johnston takes command in September, and what happens? The Confederates end up pushing their line up into Kentucky when Kentucky loses its neutrality because General Polk invades, and the North comes in this way, and the South has to go up into Kentucky. So now you've got this long line from Cumberland Gap area all the way over here to the Mississippi River. Well, it's far north, and what we've always learned from all the history books and all the teachings, decades and decades, what we've heard is Jefferson Davis did not know what he was doing because he's running this big cordon defense. He's trying to defend everything, right? Everything. When he should be tightening up and trying to fight in a tighter, non-cordon defense kind of situation. He's stretched all the way out. Well, why? Well, I'll tell you why. As we've discovered, I found a memorandum by Raines. It's 30 pages, 29, 30 pages, written near the end of the war. It's undated, probably March 1865. Extraordinarily opinionated, and it talks about everything. What he did, why he did it, who was doing what they were thinking, why they were thinking it. It's the most candid 29 pages you've ever read, ends mid-sentence. I don't know if it was 100 pages or 32, right? And what's going on is they don't have any powder to fight the war yet. Why don't you let that sink in. Now I'm going to go back for a second. When all the forts fell, all these arsenals and different forts fell across the South, I'll get there too. When they fell across the South did an inventory. Gorgas did an inventory of all the cannon powder, the cannons, and the cannonballs, everything that fell into their hands. So they're gathering all that information, they're sending it up to Richmond, and Fort Sumter takes place. And the Confederate Congress, when Fort Sumter takes place and Lincoln calls for 75,000 volunteers, the congressmen get together and they go, okay, we weren't really expecting this. Can we fight a war? I'm not kidding. Look. And they said, do we have gunpowder? And I think we have gunpowder mills. Maybe, I heard there's maybe one in Tennessee. They didn't know. I think there's maybe a couple in South Carolina in the hills. They were criminally negligent. They exploded all the time. Marines didn't even want to send wagons up there. It wasn't worth it. But they didn't know they had the capacity to even produce gunpowder. But they got into a war. So they asked Gorgas, can you do an accounting for us? Like all these forts fell in Norfolk, and we've got all this gunpowder, and historians go, oh, they got all this powder, and they fought this war. Because they fought 4 years, so of course they had enough gunpowder. No. They do an accounting, and Gorgas explains, we got this much powder, this much this much cannon powder, we can't use rifle powder here, blah, blah, blah. We don't have enough. They had enough to summarize it, a couple campaigns, and they were out. 2 big Battle of Bull Runs in Virginia, and they're out of powder. You've never heard that, have you? Shocking. In the West, they had enough for heavy skirmishing, and that was about it. And I'm talking September and October. According to Raines, he's doing this, right? According to Johnson, he's running the show. They didn't have gunpowder. This was a front. That was a fake. It was a bluff. They had to keep the North far enough outside Nashville and away from the only mills that were producing gunpowder. There were a couple mills down here in New Orleans, too. They were making mostly for New Orleans, although they were shipping some of the powder out. One of the mills exploded. I'm not going to go too much into it. It didn't contribute a lot after a few months into the war. They had to keep the Union armies out of Nashville, away from the Sycamore Mill, away from the Manchester Mill, and away from a mill that was in North Carolina, in Raleigh, which only really supplied North Carolina. They had to keep them away until Raines could get the Augusta Powder Works online. And once the Augusta Powder Works was online, they could make 5,000 to 8,000 pounds of powder a day. They could fight the war. But if there was no mill and the other mills fell, the war's over. There's no powder. Now, how else do we know this? After Sumter and after Bull Run, the newspapers are alive with editorials. You know what the editorials say? I didn't know this until I started searching newspapers.com and really looking for stuff, and I'm thinking, oh my God. There are articles from the New York Times, the London Times, the Philadelphia Times, the Washington Republican, out to Sacramento. You know what they're telling you? How can the South fight any kind of a prolonged war when all the mills are in the North? How is that possible? Doesn't a couple pushes and some heavy skirmishing and a battle or two, the war's over? What are they doing? Everybody knew it. Everybody read it. But you've never heard it. Now, do some second stage thinking. If all of that gunpowder and all that weaponry came out of American forts and arsenals, and the Confederacy could do an accounting to the pound, who else had the information? Come on, who else had the information? Yeah, the Lincoln administration had the same numbers. They're American forts. They knew too. It's curious, isn't it? Raines builds the Augusta Powder Works. We're going to come back to that too. He builds the Augusta Powder Works. Did I jump ahead here? You guys were telling me I was jumping ahead. And the Augusta Powder Works stretched for 2 miles. That mill was 2 miles long with buildings, magazines, cooling magazines, glazing houses, dusting houses, incorporating mills, 2 miles long. This is the refinery building. The only thing left today is the chimney obelisk. If you have a chance to go to Augusta, you should see it. It's quite impressive. This was probably Raines' office. The 4 corners were the offices. I believe that was his office there. This was the laboratory, which they never quite finished or used. They stuck it in there at the end. It's like a redheaded stepchild. They put it in at the end when there really wasn't enough room, but Raines realizes, oh my God, we're going to need the laboratory. We can't do everything here that I thought. So they stuck it here, and it didn't quite ever get finished. Beautiful buildings. If you look there, you can see a flagpole. See the flagpole? That's where they flew the big garrison flag 2-mile-long complex, they're building it, they start in September of 1861. They don't know when it's gonna finish. They can't say, okay, it'll be ready in December, it'll be ready in, they don't know. And in the meantime, the war is starting to heat up, and the South has to keep the North as far away as possible, and then they have to figure out, where do we put our gunpowder? Now, they've got a decent amount of gunpowder, most of it they store in Virginia as a central housing location. But you gotta think about this now. They don't know where the battles are gonna take place. And they started using a rob Peter to pay Paul strategy. And it's in writing, it's not supposed to be. They talk about not putting this stuff in writing because they don't want it to fall into Lincoln's hands and for them to know how bad off they are. But of course, some of the generals do put it in writing, we'll talk about that. But the strategy was, we're gonna send you powder when we think you need it. So it's very reactive. You can't win being reactive, but if they divided the powder out to defend everywhere, there wouldn't be enough to defend anywhere. So they were really caught between a rock and a hard place. Okay, that's the setup now. Now we're going to go to the next beginning of the real issues they faced. Okay, so now you've got Halleck and Buell up here who are opposing Elmer Sidney Johnson here. Halleck and Buell were, at that point of the war, were two of the best generals the Confederacy ever had. You laugh. Yeah, of course, they were Union generals. They were very timid, and they always thought Johnson was going to attack them, which is exactly what this helped them to believe, right? So, over here, in August of '61, Hatteras starts. That's the first pinprick against the coasts by the Union. And Hatteras, you read it right there, it's the war's first combined operations, means naval and foot soldiers. The fire was promptly reported to the commander of the infantry there, and was regularly kept up until every charge of powder and every primer had been exhausted. The ammunition was entirely exhausted. Hatteras Fort surrendered. Well, let me tell you, let me break for a second. If you go to a movie, you put on earmuffs, put a patch on one eye, put a straw up on the other eye, you have no idea what movie you're watching, you look at a screen and you go, oh, I see red. Oh, there's a little bit of blue. But you have no idea what you're looking at. As I started seeing this, and I started researching the official records digitally, because up to that time I had only researched them using the kind of a poor index at the back of the 128 volumes of books, 120 volumes of additional records. Gunpowder is under munitions of war. And I started realizing if I type the word powder in search in a volume, if the index says there's 4 entries, there's really 15. You couldn't find these entries before because they're hidden in all these letters and little bits and pieces. So I started putting this puzzle together. You know, you look at those crime shows where they got a big board and pictures all over the place and string attaching, connecting the dots and all that kind of stuff. That's me. That was like half of my room back in California. I had this big board of connecting all these pieces together because I'm starting to see the whole picture. And when you start seeing the whole picture, you go, this can't be true because it's nothing like I've been taught. That happens there. The forts fall. Not enough powder to defend them. November 7th comes. Now the Sycamore Mill is still operating. It's making about 400 pounds a day. That's enough for a regiment to do some skirmishing. That's not much. You can't do much with 400 pounds of powder a day. Sycamore Mill, the Manchester Mill is still operating. There's very little fighting up there, a little bit of skirmishing, but not much. Now it's November. Port Royal. Flag Officer DuPont leads the Union flotilla. Rains arrives on November 7th. He's inside one of the forts that's being bombarded. He often went to the front and he watched the artillery, the gunpowder, how did it work, what kind of shells, what kind of angles. He was very interested in all that kind of stuff. DuPont pushes his warships into Port Royal Sound. They open fire in the Confederate forts. The heavy shells pound the fort, drive the officers out, the garrison out. One of the reasons they left and ended all this was because they were running out of gunpowder. Gunpowder was not the prime reason why, but it was a major factor because a lot of the troops were like, we don't have enough shells to sit here and fight back. We're out. They left. Now, August, November, February, Roanoke. This is where you start to go, okay. There's a guy named Henry Wise. Henry Wise was in command, and like I say here, he spent weeks pleading for gunpowder and munitions. Historians have painted him as just a carper. Guy's always complaining, oh my God. You know, he was right. He was right about all of it. And what he was doing is saying, we don't have any gunpowder here to defend Roanoke. Our supply of gunpowder is very limited. At the first indication, however, well, this is Secretary of War. At the first indication of an attack, a supply will be sent to you. This is the Confederate Secretary of War writing to Wise. And Wise says, I don't have any gunpowder. With the number of batteries now requiring a supply, we're talking about all over the Confederacy, Charleston, Wilmington, Savannah, everywhere. With the number of batteries requiring a supply, we have a very small reserve. And that we can only part with to the point that may be actually attacked. You've never heard this. They didn't have power to fight anywhere. I am in daily hope of the receipt of a handsome importation of powder. The instant it arrives, you shall be supplied. Hope is not a strategy. They were constantly hoping this blockade runner would come in, this would happen, this would happen. Right? The large combined arms under Burnside assaulted the island, and it fell quickly. There was a little fleet called the Mosquito Fleet. It fell back up the, I think it's the Elizabeth River, and it completely ran out of ammunition, and they had to surrender the ships. And I've got all the reports of the commanders on the ships. They all said, we don't have any gunpowder. We can't fight anymore. They were out. You've all heard of the CSS Virginia, right? Some of you know her as the Merrimack, the ironclad. The Virginia could have gone out a couple weeks earlier and fought and devastated all of Hampton Roads before there was anything called the Monitor. You know why she couldn't go out? She didn't have any power. If she had gunpowder and they'd have allocated it to the CSS Virginia, there would have been no Union ships in Hampton Roads, because the Monitor wouldn't have been anywhere close. Think about that. It would have changed, I think, quite a bit. All right. So now this is going on, and Rains is going back and forth between Augusta and Tennessee. And Tennessee. He's up to Richmond. He's over these mills that are here, these little mills that are over here, which aren't what we're talking about. He's down to New Orleans. He's up to Mississippi. He puts on more railroad mileage, I think, than anybody in the South. And I really mean that. He says he lived on the railroads for 4 years, and he did. And I've got a big itinerary putting him together where he is. He's everywhere all the time, writing letters, putting architectural designs through, working with an engineer to build Augusta. They started in September. We are now in February. The mill is still not up yet. Okay? They're getting importations of niter through the saltpeter, through the caves. They're working out of the caves and the minerals, but it's full of impurities. You have to have really good pure niter to make military-grade gunpowder. So they have to refine the niter. He builds a big refinery in Nashville. What happens if the Union take Nashville? They don't have niter. They don't have good niter. They can't make gunpowder. They can't make gunpowder. They can't fight. So Rains is making this big niter facility in Nashville, and it's fantastic. But they're also importing niter through the blockade. They got most of their niter through the blockade. A lot of it came in very impure and wet, and they had to rework it. It's very difficult. The other ingredient, sulfur, they had a lot of because they used that in the sugar refinery, sugar plantations. So they had plenty of sulfur. The other thing they needed was charcoal. Charcoal, sulfur, and niter. You had to mix it all together, proper sizes, microscopic doses, fix it all, incorporate it all, make it go boom. And Rains, the chemist, did it. And what he did in Augusta is really, really amazing. But now we're in February of 1862. And what happens? Grant starts moving on Henry and Donaldson on the Tennessee, on the Cumberland, Tennessee rivers. You've all heard this story. Here's what you haven't heard yet. Rains is in Nashville. He hears the firing on Henry, and he's writing about it. Oh, I think there's a demonstration going on. Nothing can happen at this time of year. The Navy's not going to do anything. He did not think much of anything about the ability of gunships to do much of anything against strong forts. Really, nobody did that much. And boy, was he wrong. And boy, does he admit being wrong. Raines learns of Roanoke on February 10th. Remember, we're a little later than that with Donelson and Henry. By that time, he knew Henry had fallen. Donelson was in serious trouble. When Grant moves on Donelson, Raines runs to the front, goes up the river, takes a boat, gets to Donelson, and he gets close enough, somewhere on a riverbank. This guy's out there, way out there, and he's so close, he puts this sketch in one of his letters to Robert E. Lee, who's a friend of his. Lee is commanding the southeast coast of Georgia and Florida and South Carolina at that time. And he sends him this whole letter that talks about, oh my God, these are hard to beat, and here's the problem, there's this metal on them, and the iron, and this, and we're in trouble. He knew when he left Donelson to go back to Nashville, before he wrote this letter, all the way back, what's he thinking? We're doomed. Why are we doomed? Because we're going to lose Donelson, we're going to lose the Cumberland and Tennessee rivers, they can get behind us, they can flank Nashville. Oh my God, there's no Augusta mill, the Nashville mills are going to fall. So the Union victory split the front wide open, unlocked the rivers. Nashville, with its government nitrogen refinery factories, warehouses, and satellite powder mills, is now fully exposed. And within a handful of days, the whole calculus of the war changed. When Raines goes back to Nashville, he organizes everything shipped out. His best workers, he sends them to Augusta. His best pieces of machinery, he grabs trains, he grabs wagons, he gets it all out. And he sends it down to Augusta to save as much as he can. But he tells the guy in the other mill in Manchester, 60 miles south, don't evacuate, because we don't have a way to make powder. You're the only mill making powder, maybe 400 pounds a day, it's very little. Keep going, keep going, keep going, keep going, keep making powder. And he does. What's the other thing Raines is worried about? If Donelson can fall and Henry can fall, the mouth of the river at Savannah, the Fort Pulaski, could fall. And if Fort Pulaski falls at the mouth of the Savannah, the ships go up and they bomb the Augusta Powder Works, which is right there on the river in Augusta. All of a sudden, he thought it was safe. Nothing's safe. And all of a sudden, he realizes everything depends on Augusta. We don't have Augusta even running yet. And the satellite, the Sycamore Mill outside Nashville is gone. It's gone. It's gone. They can't defend it. Now, other historians often write, well, they should have fought at Nashville, they should have come back and had a compact line, and they should have done this and that. Here's why they couldn't. If you're far up in, and there were a lot of different reasons to go into Kentucky, but if you're far away from Nashville and you lose a battle, what happens? You have a chance to fall back and regroup and fight again north of Nashville, right? Maybe twice. But if you fight right at Nashville, like Atlanta, let's say, and you lose, what happens to the city? It's gone. They couldn't afford to lose the city because they couldn't afford to lose the mills. But the Sycamore Mill is 23 miles outside Nashville. It's indefensible. You can't defend both. There aren't enough men, there aren't enough troops, there aren't enough weaponry. You can see the problem now that the South was facing. So now, this falls, Nashville falls, Raines is going back to Augusta, the Manchester Mill is here, and it runs for about a month, and then the northern folks decide to launch a cavalry raid and destroy the mill because they realize how critical it is to destroy that powder mill, and they do. And now within 1 month, that mill's gone, the Nashville mill's gone, the New Orleans mills, one of them is exploded, and New Orleans is about to fall. The mill in North Carolina is making small amounts of powder, but they're keeping it in North Carolina. The Navy has a powder mill that they're building. It's barely online, but it's only for Navy powder. And that's it. All right. Now we're going to go to Fort Pulaski. It's April 10th. Fort Pulaski guards the Savannah River, which protects Augusta. Read that. When I read that, the hair stood up on my head. On December 31st, 1861, Pulaski's ordnance officer, Hardin, wrote an eyebrow-raising letter. By General Mercer's direction, Mercer commanded there, I write to urge you the necessity of sending us more powder. It is General Mercer's belief that we can whip off the next fleet upon the first attack, but that if it is renewed the next day, the attack, the Union attack, as in all probability it would be, our powder would be exhausted, and they could pass us without being able to fire a gun. We're at the end of 1861. Pulaski's guarding one of the major approaches to the Confederacy, protecting the Augusta Powder Works, and the Confederacy has enough gunpowder to fight for one day. Wow, right? Crazy. Fort Pulaski fell after a relatively short bombardment. They couldn't get up the river because there were other batteries they had now erected up the rivers below Savannah. There was a small fleet there, and the Union couldn't quite figure out how to get in there and navigate it. So they did go up the river, but Pulaski's gone, and of course the Confederacy didn't know that at the time when it fell that they couldn't. All right, so now we're going to move forward and go to New Orleans. I'm going to rush through this pretty quick. New Orleans falls. The gunpowder in New Orleans was so bad that they could see the balls flying out of the cannons and dropping into the water. Boom! Splash. Boom! Splash. And the gunners are like, oh my God, we can barely reach the enemy's ships. This is insane. And so the powder that they made in New Orleans by a guy named Mansfield Lovell, who was one of Rains's best friends, the powder was not very good. Rains knew it wasn't very good. Rains worked hard to try to get the mills operating better in New Orleans to produce better powder. Let me give you one quick aside. If you've never heard of Mansfield Lovell's study, and it's very interesting, he got screwed. Lovell was a good officer. He did wonderful things down in New Orleans, the best anybody could possibly do. I'm going to just do a quick aside because it's such an interesting character study. When he comes down, he's up in New York. He comes down in October of 1861. He comes late to the party, so to speak. He comes down. They make him a brigadier general. He's going to go down in New Orleans, but the guy that's in command there, Twiggs, is this really old guy, and he's sick, and he wants to resign. So President Davis thinks, oh, great, I'm going to make Lovell a major general and put him in command of New Orleans. But they sit him down in a room, and Lovell has a conversation with Davis. Then he has a conversation with Secretary of War Benjamin. I'm going to ad-lib a little bit, but this is what they said. Listen, Mansfield, but we know there's no gunpowder in New Orleans. We know you don't have enough to fight. We know there's not enough of anything. You don't have enough guns. You don't have enough gunpowder. We know all of that. Stop telling us. Twiggs is constantly telling us every day bombarding. We know that's the deal. You get the command, but you shut your mouth. We don't need to hear anything. Lovell says, yes, sir. I'm good with that. He gets down there on, I think, the 17th. On the 18th, he writes a letter this big, are you kidding me? And Lovell and Davis and Benjamin have a long memory. And in the end, when New Orleans fell, because of nothing Lovell did, they conspired and they rigged the court-martial against him and screwed him. And it haunted him for the rest of his life, and he never got any satisfaction, and he doesn't get any of the plaudits he deserves. Davis and Benjamin screwed him, and Lovell didn't deserve it. Now New Orleans is gone. The powder mills that are there are gone. Pulaski's gone. They're all along the coast now. Big problems. Nashville's fallen. The line's going back here into a lot of Middle Tennessee is gone. Augusta starts working on April 10th, 1862. Well, now let's talk about the rest of the war very quickly, and then we'll take a bunch of questions. So, what about the rest of the war? Rains ends up making more than 3.2, I think, million pounds of powder in 3 years. The powder is considered some of the best powder in the world. I discovered all in the National Archives. It was very interesting. All the records nobody had ever looked at. Some were still at ribbons on. It was just crazy. And the archivists, let me go in there and behind the scenes, and we opened up stuff. And they were day-to-day records, work records, shipping records, powder records. It was really amazing to work with this stuff. And what it shows is what they made, how they made it, where they made it, and where it went. Basically, what Rains did was he supplied roughly 95% of the powder for everything east of the Mississippi. They had a couple small mills in Texas and Arkansas for the West, Trans-Mississippi. But Rains did everything east of the Mississippi. So all the powder that was used, there would be no Chancellorsville, no Gettysburg, nothing if it wasn't for Rains. Because nobody could have done what he did. I'm telling you, nobody could. And he puts that all together, makes the powder, and you can see the records. They're going to fight and go north into Pennsylvania. You see massive movements of powder up into the Richmond area for the Army of Northern Virginia, or over to the Army of Tennessee. They fight Gettysburg. Rains is working overtime, and they're shipping more powder back because it was a just enough to keep fighting operation. We'll give you all the powder we can give you. You can fight, but we got to get you more right away because it's not like you're sitting on 6 months of powder. You're sitting on about 30 or 40 days of powder. So it's a just-on-time sort of operation. So now we're going to go to, you understand how 1861 has a little different tinge to it when you start looking at it, right? 1864 has a different look at it, and I want to sort of spend 5 minutes on this and then go to your questions. In 1864, Sherman invades Georgia. One of his missions is, second part of his order from Grant that historians tend to gloss over, is that when you go inside the interior of Georgia, you can go against anything that you think is necessary to destroy the ability of the South to wage war. Their munitions or anything you want to do. In other words, you can destroy Augusta. Go anywhere you want, do whatever you think is the best way to win the war. Did they know about Augusta? Oh yeah, it's in all the newspapers. Did they know how big it was? Oh yeah, it was in all the newspapers. Did they know that it was producing this much powder for the South? Oh yeah, it was in all the newspapers. Rains even sat for interviews with the London Times, which is then reproduced in all the northern newspapers. They knew all about it. I've got letters from northern spies that are down there looking at Augusta. It was undefended. Rains was constantly trying to get troops there to station there. And the South just didn't do it. It was just mind-boggling. It drove it nuts. But everybody knew about the mill. If the mill falls, the war is over in 45 days. Okay? Sherman invades in May. Could have easily sent, he had enough men, he could have easily moved out, divided the Southern Army if he needed to, struck out for Augusta, 135 miles or something, and destroyed it. He didn't. Could have done it in May, the war would have been over in July. Could have done it in June, the war would have been over in August. Could have done it in July, the war would have been over in September. He never did. He pins Hood's army down against Atlanta now, Johnson and the Hood. They're pinned down there, they don't have enough men to go. What could they have done? They could have destroyed it then. Sent some cavalry and a brigade of artillery. No, he didn't. He never did. He takes Atlanta. He moves to the sea. Rains is sure he's going to come for Augusta. There's like 2,000 troops guarding Augusta. It's just nothing there. Rains dismantles a bunch of important machinery, ships whatever powder he's got, he's shipping across the river into South Carolina, try to protect it. What does Sherman do? He feints at Macon, he feints at Augusta, he divides everything up, he goes straight over to Savannah. He bypasses Augusta. The South is like, what? Then he does it again when he goes north into the Carolina campaign. He feints against Augusta, he feints against Charleston, and he goes straight up north into South Carolina and then North Carolina. He bypasses Augusta again. I spent years and I wrote articles, and I feel like an idiot now, saying it was the war's biggest strategic mistake. He could have ended the Civil War at any time he wanted. One of his generals in his report said, I tried to get Sherman to let me take my division up the railroad to destroy Augusta, but he would not let me. So I'm sitting there working on my computer one day, and my wife, the compassionate nurse, says, what's got you frustrated, sweetheart? And I figured, well, I'm just, this whole Sherman thing, and she doesn't know anything about the Civil War, but she's real smart. And I was thinking inside the box. She was thinking like a non-Civil War person outside the box. And she said, so tell me a little bit about what's going on. So I'm explaining Sherman didn't destroy it. He explained later after the war, he cut all the railroads and they couldn't ship powder, but that wasn't true. They shipped powder even to Lee in March of 65, they were shipping powder. And so I didn't understand, why wouldn't he? I mean, it was the war's biggest mistake. It was an obvious mistake. She says, okay, now hold on. This is that red-haired guy, right? A little crazy? I said, okay, you can describe him that way. And she says, was he good? I said, yeah, he was a very capable general. Was he at the peak of his powers? Yeah. She goes, I mean, he was a military guy his whole life, right? I said, yeah, pretty much. She said, okay, so he's at the peak of his powers, he's leading his armies. the war's not over, right? There's still a lot of Confederate armies in the field. I said, oh yeah. She said, well, he didn't want to take it. Okay, I never quite looked at it that way. She goes, why? He just didn't want to take it. I said, okay, why didn't he want to take it? So we start talking about it. And I think she's right. Here's her conclusion. Well, honey, if he takes it, doesn't the war end? I said, yeah, it ends in about 45 days. She said, well, what happens then? Well, walk me through, because I don't know enough about it. What happens if the war just ended? And I went, you know, the wow, I could have had a V8 moment. Holy moly. If you have hundreds of thousands of Confederate troops in the field and they're not defeated and they suddenly can't fight anymore, what do you end up with?
Guerrilla.
A massive, chaotic, anarchical situation of guerrilla warfare. It would be chaos. There's still slavery. There's no surrender. The troops are at the fronts. They can't fight anymore. You'd have mass disintegration. What the heck would have happened? It would have been a disaster. And so I said, that's really interesting, okay? So if he takes it in June or July or August, yeah, you're right. She said, so maybe he wanted the war to continue until there was a surrender, until the South knew it was beaten. And then I started thinking, you know, she's absolutely right. This is, you know, you can't get in his head yet, and I'm still looking for some more evidence. But if you think about it, Augusta is the only major Confederate industrial city in the Confederacy that didn't surrender or was occupied. And it had the most important facility in the entire Confederacy. They didn't want to take Augusta. They wanted to defeat the armies in the field, and they needed a complete and utter collapse to get the war over. That's why they didn't take Augusta. Please, Pastor. George reigns. War ends. George reigns stays in Augusta. His wife ends up going back and forth. She joined him in Augusta in like late '62. She goes back and forth to Newburgh, New York. He never goes up because the old man's still alive. Two of her brothers fought in the Union Army. One of them was severely wounded with powder that he made. So, and they just were very estranged family. He stays down there. He goes to the Medical College of Georgia. They give him an honorary degree. Ends up running the college, becomes the dean. He's teaching chemistry classes and medical classes. Just an amazing guy, right? Just a Renaissance man kind of guy. He does investigations for murder, like a CSI 1868 kind of thing, and just has an amazing life after the war. He has one daughter, and I could never find anything about her, not a thing other than that her name was Fanny. We had no pictures. I don't even have a picture of his wife, which is just sad, right? Well, I finally found a picture of Fanny in a Newburgh library that was misfiled, the Little County Historical Society. The lady up there kept telling her, look here, look here, look here. She finally found it. She goes, oh my God, I found a picture of Fanny. Well, we found out also, she ended up getting very sick in 1883. And she lingered for like 19 or 20 days in a Boston suite where they had put her. She was on vacation with her mom and somebody else. She got sick. Some kind of sepsis inside her intestinal tract, which would have been horrifically painful. She lingered and died in the room, and she was, I think, 23 years old. And Raines got enough time to get a message that his daughter is in this hotel room up in Boston dying. He takes a train and goes north. Well, who else is there? All the Northern family is there. So they're in this same big room most of the day, and I'm sure they were sleeping in a different room. So he would have met his father-in-law again for the last time. God knows what kind of conversations they had. That's Fanny. She dies, and that was their only kid. So at this point in time, Raines goes up north, by the way, at the end, 1898, after Homer dies, spends a couple of years, and he wrote Civil War diaries. And he talks about leaving his Civil War diaries and where they are, and they're in his cabinet, and blah, 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 blah. I can't find them. I think they were thrown out. When I was working in the 1990s, and I'm communicating with the Newburgh people in Newburgh, New York, by letter, because there's no internet or anything else, and I'm writing back and forth, and they had just emptied the Raines house, not them, but whoever bought it, and there were trunks and all kinds of stuff, and they took them to the dump. And so probably they were in there. Yeah. and letters and all kinds of stuff. But that's Rains. That's how important it is. I'm 3/4 of the way done writing his book, and I'm going to separate this into 2 books because what did the Lincoln administration know? When did they know it? Why did they run the war policy they did? If they didn't know it, why didn't they know it? If they do know it, what did they do? And so I'm going to have a thin book first that's going to talk about a lot of this kind of stuff that I just told you, with I think a chapter of just questions for future historians to answer. And then the next book, I have to suss all this out of this big book I'm writing. Then the next book is going to be the biography of Rains, and I've given you like 2 or 3 or 5% of what I found. I'm going to leave you with one more thing to really explode your heads. If you're thinking, come on, Savas, there wasn't really a bluff going on. I mean, come on, come on, really? Oh yeah. And I found proof, and it was hiding in plain sight. In April of 1863, Jefferson Davis gave a presentation, an announcement speech, this yearly speech to the Southern population. It's right there in the official records. And when I read it, I went, oh my gosh, are you kidding me? I called up a friend of mine who's a Davis historian. He says, I don't know anything about that. He's never seen it. I looked in the 12-volume collected papers of Jefferson Davis. It's not even in there. Didn't even mention it. I talked to the lady who put it together, Linda Christ, a wonderful historian. She didn't know about it. Somehow they had missed it. And what it said, and I should have quoted it exactly, but I'm very close. We needed to convince the enemy we were stronger than we were for as long as we needed until we could get the munitions of war we needed to fight north. And now we have it, and now we're being successful and we're fighting the war. It was a bluff. And it all started in a hotel room with George Rains, who came down from New York to build the Augusta Powder Works so they could fight a war as long as they could keep the Union Army away for about a year. And they did. That's my point. I don't know how much time we have, but I would love to take any questions that you might have for me. No? Yes, sir.
So when Atlanta fell and Sherman marched, see how did powder get from Augusta to Richmond?
Yeah. So when Sherman went through and cutting some of the railroads, when his troops were gone, the Rains and some of his people sent out engineers and they rebuilt parts of the railroads. They made wagon roads around the breaks, and they kept shipping powder. And we've got all the records that show how much powder went where. The last amount of powder that was shipped to Virginia was at the end of March, so it didn't reach Lee before he evacuated. But they were still shipping powder. Bentonville, the whole North Carolina campaign, all of that powder was shipped into there after Sherman bypassed them the first time. They couldn't have, if he had blown up the mill, none of that would have been possible. Yes, sir.
That must have been during the Overland campaign. Lee must have had a hard time keeping up with powder for that, because that was like constant.
Well, they were constantly shipping it up. Yeah, constantly. And they by that time of the war, they sort of knew where the main hot spots were going to be, right? Because it was becoming more focused. So instead of dispersing powder to different places now, they knew exactly where it needed to go. And what they did is they shipped the powder to the arsenals, the Richmond Arsenal, the Atlanta Arsenal, the Macon Arsenal, and they would make it into the artillery cartridges, the small arms cartridges, and then those were shipped, to the front. Yes.
Ted, any of if we get any powder through foreign shipments,
Yeah.
what percent do you think?
Yeah, we got, there were powder. The Kate brought in a bunch of powder. There's several blockade runners that brought in gunpowder. They brought in gunpowder up through Mexico. The problem with this is it wasn't much in the scheme of things. It wasn't much, and a lot of it was wet, and it wasn't good, and they had to rework it, and even when they reworked it, it was still not very effective. A lot of the powder they captured early in the war at all the arsenals was Mexican War era powder, and it just had lost a lot of punch. And so Yeah, they had some powder that come in. It was helpful when it came in, but it's not much. I give you a quick example. At the end of Pulaski fell, there were about 40,000 pounds of powder in the fort. And a lot of it came from a blockade Kate and some other things. The problem with that is, I was talking to a historian yesterday about this. He's a Pulaski historian. And I said, well, there are 48 guns in Pulaski, and a lot of those guns took 20-pound charges. Do the math, and they had enough for like 40 rounds each. Well, that's about once every 20, 30 minutes. That's 14 hours of fighting. Powder goes fast. It goes so fast at the beginning of the war, don't hook me yet. At the beginning of the war, I got reports from company commanders, reports, letters, diaries, company commanders up to Army commanders who said, no skirmish firing because we don't have gunpowder. No target practicing because we don't have gunpowder. Braxton Bragg in Pensacola, early in the war, when they were having some fighting on Pensacola, Bragg puts in a letter. Of course, it's Bragg, right? I know I'm not supposed to put this in writing, but let me tell you, I don't have enough gunpowder to do X, Y, Z, so what do you want me to do if the Union does this? So Army command down to company command, they're all saying the same thing for that first year of the war. What are we going to do? We don't have enough to fight. And Raines talks about it in that memo I told you over and over. I can't believe they didn't attack us. Did they really believe our bluff and that we were this strong? They must have, because a good push here and there, we hardly had enough for a long, hot skirmish. That's a quote. And he's the guy who supplied it. It's amazing. It's an amazing story, I think. Yes, ma'am?
Couldn't they have gotten some of the powder from Europe or like England or something?
Well, they did. They brought it in on blockade runners.
Right.
But the blockade got tighter and tighter.
Okay.
And so the problem was that the powder came. If they could get it in, it got wet. It was very wet. And then they couldn't just use it. Then they had to rework it. And they didn't get enough in to really make a substantial difference.
Exactly, but to go along with that, okay, so they did get a little bit of the powder from Europe, but when did that stop? Like 1863?
Yeah, effectively after 63, they weren't really getting much in. And they didn't get much in anyway. They got a few big shipments in. That was earlier than it was gone. By the time, you have to understand, by the time you disperse this powder, Charleston was using the most powder of anywhere. All the Charleston batteries and the forts, they were using so much powder, it was incredible. And the Charleston powder, you could ship up 10,000 pounds, 12,000 pounds, 25,000 pounds, and that powder's gone in days. So you get a blockade runner with 50,000 pounds of gunpowder or 80,000 pounds of gunpowder, you disperse it to Wilmington and Charleston, the powder's gone in a couple of weeks.
I do agree with your hypothesis as to why Augusta was not sacked by the Union Army. But when the whole rationale be that since the goal of the war on the northern side was oil country unification, that it would be one less industrial site of the city that they would have to rebuild that for. It was one of the most important industrial cities in the South.
Yeah.
Because they're reunify. Destroy it, we either have to rebuild it, which would make the United States an incident for future conflict if they arise.
Yeah, that's a really good point. There's two responses to that. They weren't worried, and they show that everywhere about destroying cities.
Oh yeah.
Number one. And number two, they didn't have to destroy Augusta. They only had to destroy the Augusta Powder Works. The Augusta Powder Works were outside the city of Augusta, a couple miles, and you could see them from miles away because of that high chimney. And they could have destroyed it from a mile and a half away with 10-pound Parrott rifles. And by the way, Augusta ends up as a line of entrenchments around it, right? They were very incomplete, and they didn't even cover the powder works. Just to show you how bare everything was. Yes?
Yes. Could you make an estimate, like how much powder did the South need in the Battle of Gettysburg? Just an estimate.
Yeah, and actually, I do actually have those numbers, and I, off the top of my head, if I just tried to tell you, I couldn't. But if you want to email me, I'll give you that information.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not trying to not answer you.
But it would be several weeks of production?
Oh, yeah. So Raines was making on average like 3,500 pounds a day. It made up to, I think, like 7,000 or 8,000 pounds. They didn't work on Sundays. And they couldn't work at night because of, the lighting problem. But they were making powder all the time, and they made 3,200,000 pounds in 3 years. Not working on Sundays. He started to work for almost a month when he moved the plant into South Carolina, so they were down that whole time. And so you start thinking about how much powder they were making every day. At the end of the war, there was a bunch of powder left. The Union took it. They tested it at DuPont. They said it was just unbelievably good powder. The powder mill fell apart at the end of the war. They ended up selling it. Brains made a plea, please leave something as a memorial, and they left the chimney. At the top of the chimney, and I'm trying to get this worked out with the people who run it, the top of the chimney in the cornice is a time capsule. Nobody knows what's in it.
When does it feel?
That's the problem. Yeah, that's exactly right. And so I'm trying to talk to the people that I know there to, one of those big old whatever you need to go up there and open up the top and take it out and see what the capsule. It's in a lead box. We don't know what it is.
When they're putting the Confederacy together, they realize they don't have these materials.
Yes.
Do you think that they thought maybe the North wouldn't fight so hard, just let them be?
She asked when the Confederacy was starting, doing this, and they were starting a war, then they could bomb Fort Sumter. Did they really think that there was going to be a war if they didn't have this kind of material? They didn't know they couldn't fight it because they didn't know they didn't have bombs. They didn't even realize they needed the gunpowder. A lot of these politicians, they thought, well, we got the fort, captured the arsenal. There's a lot of powder. We can fight, but the war is going to be a battle. Maybe like a Manassas kind of battle, Bull Run, and then it's over. And we take Fort Sumter. Lincoln's not going to really raise troops to invade the North, the South, and then he did. And so they're thinking, oh my gosh, how do we fight a battle? But it'll probably end now in Manassas. We won. They're going to sue for peace. He brings in more men of the Union armies, and then they're like, what are we going to do? And then they really realize we're in this for the long haul. This isn't going to end soon, and we don't have the ability to make gunpowder. What are we going to do? It was that tight, and it changed their strategy everywhere. Yes, sir.
So I have a theory about the whole Civil War, about if the war was won or lost on terrible intelligence.
Yes, it was.
Okay?
Yeah.
Your supposition about why they didn't go to Augusta, I've heard they was defended. They were totally amazed how little defensive was there. And when the generals had their little war council with Sherman, they had this discussion about going there, but they thought that it was defended well. And that they had their marching orders to go to Savannah, and that would just slow them down.
Yeah.
So it wasn't that they wanted the war to keep going. Again, Sherman was an Army general, a West Point graduate. He followed his orders.
Right.
He had orders to go to Savannah. And that was the number one focus he had in going.
Yeah, and I looked at that. Here's the counterpoint to that. They had spies in Augusta that told them exactly what was there. They knew. They also knew there weren't full fortifications. There were like 2,500 to 4,000 guys in there, which is not much. If you can go and take Atlanta, because Atlanta is that important, defended by 75,000 guys with gigantic entrenchments, you could go north to Augusta and fight a minimal battle to end the war. If Atlanta fell, the war doesn't end, and the war didn't end. But if Augusta fell, the war's over.
But if Atlanta fell, Lincoln got reelected.
That's right, it did.
So
But the war didn't
much
end.
more important at that point.
Well, maybe, right?
But when your boss is telling you, you go do this.
Well, yeah, but that wasn't his orders. His orders from Grant were go after the Army of Tennessee, take Atlanta. The second part of the orders that people skip past is do anything you can in the state to demolish their ability to fight the war,
Right.
which gave him full discretion to do what he wanted. And once he was in Georgia, they gave him discretion to do what he wanted. And here's the other thing, too. Your points are good points, and these are points I struggle with constantly. I've got to constantly balance these things out. When did they know? When did they know it? Intelligence is, not always very accurate, all that stuff. Sherman argued after the war, because these people tell him, well, you didn't, you could have taken Augusta. His argument was, and it was a lie, I didn't need to take Augusta because I cut all the railroads all the way around it. They couldn't ship powder. Here's the problem, and he says he knew this in advance. So I'm just going to cut the railroads. It's not true. Here's why it's not true. He wasn't never going up into the Carolinas. He was going to go to Savannah, take ships, and go up to Virginia. So he never knew he would be in South Carolina cutting those railroads, North Carolina cutting those railroads. He didn't know that when he bypassed Augusta the first time and goes to Savannah. He didn't know that. He didn't know he was going to go up the other way and cut all the lines. He was supposed to be boats up to Virginia, which would have left that whole stream of logistics into Virginia and Carolinas completely intact. It's just that he skipped it. We can't read his mind. Why? He didn't take it.
Well, after Savannah, he was being told to come join you.
Yes.
And we will attack Richmond. We will seize you.
Yep.
So that, and grand focus was we.
It was.
So.
And they wanted to
that was his strategy.
and they squeezed him from the south when he moved up. That's right.
So they were just avoiding any extraneous activity that was going to slow them down.
Well, yeah, apparently.
I mean, they didn't plan on having a battle because he wasn't even around when it happened.
Right. And that's right. And my conclusion after all of this is that if you can take something, if you fought harder battles that don't end the war, but you can take the Augusta Powder Works that isn't even behind entrenchments, and you know there's no main army there because they know who's there. You got spies telling you it ends the war. You do it, but they didn't. It's a fabulous issue.
I agree with you 100%. They just weren't that sophisticated yet anymore. Their concept of war was very tactical.
Let me tell you why I disagree with that. When the Manchester Mill, 60 miles south of Nashville, was still operating, they formed a cavalry force to ride 50 miles to destroy it because they knew destroying a powder mill was critically important to ending the war. And so they write about it, they talked about it, they have to destroy the munitions of war. They were trying to take Richmond early in the war because they wanted to help destroy the Treader Powder Works and other Treader Mills and other places. They knew where these mills were, they knew they needed to destroy it, and they talked about it in the newspapers. Early in the war, when they say there's very few places in the South, almost none, and then they have the Augusta Powder Works, they're talking about it, they repeatedly talk about, well, why couldn't you just send a strike force and destroy the mill? And they were going to do that from Pocatello, or wherever you pronounce it, South Carolina. They were going to run a cavalry strike in and destroy it. They didn't. Could have. It's a fascinating question. Make sure you keep pressing me on this kind of stuff, because I love this stuff. A few more questions. I don't know how much time we have.
Let's take one more question, you guys, and then it's a complicated.
Sherman was an emotional guy.
Yeah.
He wanted to be on the end, be at the closing blow.
Yeah.
Please surrender.
Yeah.
He's written about that.
Yeah.
He wanted to get there.
Yeah.
He got to Savannah, the work ships to move his army, so he said, fine, we'll walk.
Yeah.
You know, so I think that could be a player here.
Well,
He was in a hurry to get from Atlanta to the sea.
might have
He
been.
ordered the ships, and then he just said, okay, we're going to march.
Yeah.
And he bypassed some targets that he thought he might have taken.
Except cavalry could have taken it. And cavalry argued that they could take it. And they could have.
But I think what Sherman wasn't worried about, thinking about that, maybe he should have been thinking about it. He was thinking about, I want to be there.
Well, if that's the case, then if that's the case, my original thesis is right, that it was one of the greatest strategic mistakes of the war. I don't think it was anymore. Let me conclude with this. We have a modern day example of what would have happened if the Confederate armies were left in the field. That was 2003 in Iraq. When we ran up and defeated Iraq so quickly in 2003, and we know now from all the different Iraqi reports, that the guys in the field, they just went home. And they're sitting here thinking, well, we weren't even defeated. I mean, what is it? We were screwed. Our general surrendered us, and Saddam did us wrong, and blah, blah. And what happens then? They turn to this massive guerrilla terror campaign. And so if you've got Confederate armies in the field and they don't think they're really beaten, they just happen to run out of ammo, what's going to happen? Well, the North was smart enough to know you can't just leave these big armies sitting in the field. But I can't read minds. So I'm still working on it. Thanks very much.